Hello, my name is Phil. I'm the priest in charge of the Draycott and Lem Valley Benefice. This video is just me going through the PowerPoints of an evening we held at Stretton Church earlier this week, going through a little bit about what happens in church. The idea is just to give you a bit more of an understanding about the Church of England, of which we are part, and about what happens in our services. We'll look at things like what do we wear at the front, what we're putting on the table when it comes to communion, all kinds of things like that. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to open up our slides now as we work through them. So I just want to start by giving you a very brief history of the Church of England. I've put very underlined because I don't want to go into lots of detail. But I think it's important to understand this because it kind of puts everything we're about to say into context. So the Church of England started in 597 AD when Pope Gregory sent missionaries to England. So at this point, the Church of England was formed. It was part of the Roman Catholic Church, and all the first Archbishop of Canterbury's had allegiance to the Pope. So the Church of England was part of the Catholic Church until in 1534, the Church of England broke away from the Church in Rome when Henry VIII passed the Act of Supremacy. It's worth flagging at this point that this was a power grab rather than a religious move. So Henry VIII quite liked the Catholic way of worshipping. He just likes their money and their land more. So we're separate from Rome, still very much following in the worship patterns and styles of Rome. However, in 1547, Henry VIII's son Edward becomes the king. Now, Edward is a Protestant. He's been brought up and taught theology by Protestants. So when he becomes the head of the Church of England, he starts changing all of the services to be more Protestant. And throughout this time, people who are more wedded to the Catholic way of doing things experience persecution until Edward dies and Mary I becomes queen in 1553. Now, Mary is a through and through Catholic. So she returns the Church of England to the Pope's authority, and the services start to be more Catholic again. So all of those changes that came in under Edward are reversed, and people who are more wedded to the Protestant way find themselves being killed. And then in 1558, Elizabeth I becomes queen. She takes the Church of England back from Rome, but rather than continuing this back and forth seesaw, she creates what we call the Elizabethan settlements, where she tries to get everybody to stop killing each other. And she says essentially, it's fine to be a Catholic and it's fine to be a Protestant. Don't be too Catholic or too Protestant. And so the great Anglican fudge was born. And the Church of England to this day still calls itself both Catholic and Reformed, Reformed being another word for Protestant. So what does that actually mean that Anglicanism is? What is Anglicanism? Well, Anglicanism means being a people on a spectrum. I've got a little picture of a spectrum here. We're quite a divided people, so we could have anything on our spectrum. But I'm going to show you this one that's particularly thinking about worship. So if we think of worship styles and worship preferences as a spectrum, at one end of the spectrum, in the blue side, you've got what we call the low church. And at the far end of that side of the spectrum, you've got people that are basically Baptists, but still consider themselves Church of England. Then the other side of the spectrum, we might call high church or Anglo-Catholic. And at the far end of that spectrum, we get people that are basically Catholic. They still look to the Pope, still read what the Pope says, still follow the Pope, but consider themselves part of the Church of England. There's two extremes, as on any spectrum, but most people fit somewhere in between the extremes. I put a little comment in there with the arrow saying most people think they are in the middle. That's my experience, that you never think of yourself as being an extreme this or an extreme that. You would just think of yourself as being in the middle and just assume everybody else is an extreme. So most people think they're in the middle. The middle we sometimes call middle of the road. So there are differences between the high and the low church. Some sweeping generalizations here, but the low end of the spectrum, the kind of blue side, the focus of people that tend to identify with the low church is more on words. So they're interested in what the Bible says. They're interested in the parts of the service where we explore the Bible. So the sermon is a big, important part of low church worship. That's in contrast to the high church, where sacrament, i.e. communion, is the kind of high point of the service. And it's worth saying, actually, at this point, as a priest in the Church of England, you are ordained to proclaim Christ in word and sacrament. So the Church of England line is that the sacrament, communion, and word, the sermon, are important. They're both important to Anglicans. So this spectrum is about which you prefer out of those two things that every Anglican should say is important. And the reason for that divergence is that the low church tend to believe that when we take communion, we're doing something symbolic. So the bread and the wine reminds us of Jesus' body and blood. Nothing special happens to it when we consecrate it in communion. It's just there as a reminder of what happened on Maundy Thursday at the Last Supper and then on the cross on Good Friday. In contrast, the high church, the more Anglo-Catholic side, think actually something's happening when we have communion that goes beyond just a symbolic reminding of something. Actually, to some extent, that bread and that wine actually becomes Jesus' body and blood. If you got right to the far extreme of that spectrum, they might call what they call transubstantiation. They actually believe that it literally becomes Jesus' body and blood, which was a belief in the Catholic Church that we sort of rejected at the Reformation. There are still people within the Church of England that do hold to transubstantiation. And that difference finds its expression in some of the language we use. So if you're more of a low church persuasion, you might be more inclined to talk about the table at the front of church. Whereas if you're from a high church tradition, you're more likely to use the word altar. And similarly, when we talk about bowing, and if you go into a high church environment, you're likely to see people bowing to the altar, to each other, as a mark of respect for actually something special is happening on this table. So we bow to the altar and we are very formal around the altar. Whereas the low church don't tend to bow towards the altar. It's much less formal. We will come on to robes in a minute, but robes, you might find that the high church Anglo-Catholic are more comfortable using robes and like using lots of robes, whereas depending on where you are on the spectrum, on the low church side, you might be less inclined to wear robes. For being colloquial about it, we sometimes talk about the high church as being bells and smells, and we think about the low church as being happy, clappy. So all of these different views of communion, emphases, and what people like are all kind of represented within the Church of England. We call it a broad church because actually you can be basically a Catholic that still looks to the Pope and consider yourself Church of England. And you can be basically a Baptist whose theology in some ways is more in keeping with the Baptist Church than it is with the majority of the Church of England. But we're a wide church and we seek to accommodate and welcome people all across this spectrum into our church. So that's the worship spectrum. As I say, we're quite divided people. We could change this. We could have liberal at one end and evangelical or conservative at the other end. There's all sorts of different ends we could put on that spectrum. But the point is, the Church of England is a broad church that encompasses people that have a lot of different theologies and worship preferences. So if we are this broad church, if we are so different, what do we have in common? Well, the thing we have in common is the words that we use in worship. So Anglican worship is worship that follows either the Book of Common Prayer or common worship. I should probably say at this point there should be a little asterisk next to common worship, because actually, as well as common worship, there are some other liturgies that are authorized but not technically common worship. But the point is that all of our worship should follow the rules and the words that are set out in either of these two books. But what's the difference between the two books? Well, the Book of Common Prayer was written around about the Reformation time. It was tweaked a little bit afterwards, but it's still with us in its current form that was kind of set in place after around about 1662. It was until the 1980s the only form of worship you would find in an Anglican church. And I think of the BCP as being a bit like an Indian restaurant set meal, in that if you go into an Indian restaurant and you order set meal A, you get the following things off the list and there's no discussion. You've paid the set price, you get these set foods, that's it, job done. In the same way, Book of Common Prayer, if you're having a communion service, you follow through what it says in the book. There's no room for deviation or discussion. It's all set out for you. You're having communion, you read it like this. You're having morning prayer, you read it like this. You're having evening prayer, read it like this. You're having a funeral, read it like this. So there's no room for flexibility because the Book of Common Prayer has set out each service and we just follow it through. And the Book of Common Prayer is actually enjoyed by people all across the whole spectrum of Anglican worship styles. As you think about that spectrum, I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but actually, if you're high up church, if you prefer a more formal, more Eucharistic focused service, actually, the Book of Common Prayer is great for that. It's been tried, it's been tested, it's been there for 500 years, and all sorts of different ways of doing it with solemnity and making it formal are all there. So actually people in the high church really like the big Book of Common Prayer. But conversely, actually, if you're more of the low church persuasion, then actually chances are you'd really like the BCP if you explored what it says in there for lots of reasons. But one of them in particular is actually when you read through the theology and the words there, it's pretty explicitly biblically focused, and it does seem to kind of underline the theology that a lot of the low church subscribers would subscribe to. So it's common because actually everybody enjoys it whichever end of the spectrum you're from, even if it's slightly different elements of it that you feel particularly drawn to. So that's the Book of Common Prayer. Common Worship, on the other hand, is a bit of a different beast. It was authorized in the year 2000, so it's much more recent than the Book of Common Prayer, and it is not a single book like the Book of Common Prayer. So I kind of liken this to a Boots meal deal, whereas Book of Common Prayer, when you're Indian takeaway, you get your set meal, which tells you exactly what you're having. When you go into Boots to get your Boots meal deal, you're told to collect a main, a side, and a drink. But actually, you've got a whole plethora of options for what that drink, main, and side might be. You might have sandwiches, Coke, and a crisps. You might have a salad, a smoothie, and a chocolate bar. You can kind of mix and match between these different categories within the chiller. And common worship, is a bit like that. So you can see in the picture here that there's a lot of different volumes for it, whereas Book of Common Prayer was one book with everything. You can see there that's just a selection of the different common worship materials that you can choose from. So you can really build and shape a service using the set texts that have been written, that have been improved, and kind of take a bit from here, a bit from there, and just create the service that does what you are looking to do. It's and it's actually even wider than that because whilst we have these common worship services that have been set and written by the Church of England themselves, there are also other services that aren't written by the Church of England, which we think of as authorised. So we can pinch a bit from that as long as we put it with a bit from common worship. So it's a much more free and flowing thing, and actually you can put together pretty much any service you would want using bits and pieces from all the different services. And this has its pros and its cons. But just like BCP, it's a form of worship that can be enjoyed wherever you are on that worship spectrum that we looked at earlier. If you're high church, if you're more Anglo-Catholic, then you can select the words and the phrases and put a service together that really reflects your preferred style of worship and really says what you want it to say. But conversely, if you're more of the low church persuasion, then you can also shape a service that really fits with what you're trying to do, what your worship preferences are, and what you want to say. So just like BCP, it's something we can hold in common. We might appreciate different parts of it. We might celebrate it in different ways, but it's there for everybody wherever you are on that worship spectrum. So why am I telling you this as we start? Well, the reason I'm telling you this now at the offset is because whatever we do in church, it's shaped by things. We like to think it's shaped by three things: our theology, our history, and the rules in our worship books, by which I mean BCP and common worship. And what we do is shaped inevitably by these things. But there's also a fourth thing that shapes them, our worship, which no one really says out loud very often, but it is really true. Our purely practical and logistical concerns also make a massive difference to how we worship. So we've got these four things that shape how we worship as Anglicans. But as Anglicans, we all have slightly different theologies. We are all inspired by slightly different parts of our history. We all like different parts of those different worship books and for different reasons. And we all worship in churches that look slightly different to each other, so have slightly different practical considerations. So although we hold all this stuff in common, although we are the Church of England, worship might look very different from church to church. And what we're going to do now is we're going to explore some different things that might be going on in church. We'll flag what is happening in our benefice, but also some of the reasons behind that and reasons why you might see it done slightly differently elsewhere. So we're going to move on now. We're going to start thinking about robes and what vicars wear. So we're going to have a little think now about clergy wear and what you might see people at the front wearing at services in the Church of England. We'll look at robes in a moment, but first I want to briefly mention dog collars. I'm wearing one now. I'm showing you this slide mainly because one of my really sad passions is finding catalogues for clergy wear and enjoying some of the particularly terrible photos that adorn the pages of those catalogues. These are all from the Whipple's catalogue. Unfortunately, Whipple's are going to be closing down in the next 12 months, but they're a clerical outfitter shop who used to get their catalogues sent to us in Theology College, and they don't appear to have had a new photo shoot since the 1980s. Other clergy outfitters are available, but I just thought you had to take in the glory that is these four shots of clergy people wearing dog collars. The detachable collar is actually much more recent than you might think. It was invented in 1865 by a Church of Scotland minister in Glasgow. It's entirely there as a kind of a symbol of the fact that you're clergy and you're marked out as being clergy rather than someone in secular employment. So I suppose in kind of modern equivalents, it's a bit like if you go into a hospital and you see someone that has a blue lanyard with NHS written on it, and that signifies that they work for the NHS, that's their place of work, and they're a member of staff in the hospital. The dog collar is meant to symbolise that we work for the church, and we're sort of church staff, as it were. So that's the dog collar. But we're going to move on now, and we're going to think about robes, because the thing with robes is there's a massive plethora of robes. I'm not going to dig into all the different robes you can wear, but basically there are two kind of main get-ups on the robe front for normal clergy. First of which we call choir dress. And so if you're really into your robes and you differentiate between different robes at different times, these are the robes that are most usually reserved for services that aren't sacraments. So I should say, just by way of sacraments, sacrament in its most basic form means an outward sign of and inward truth. So communion and baptism services are the two sacramental services we have in the Church of England. And we would say communion is sacramental because when you take the bread and the wine, it's an outward sign of something that's going on deep inside you. You're outwardly taking a sip of wine, having some bread or a wafer as a sign that actually God is working in you and you are sharing in that Last Supper with Jesus. Similarly, baptism is a sacrament because when we put the water on the baby's face or we are submerged in it, if we're baptized as adults, we are symbolically saying we're dying to death and raising again in Jesus. And that's all a symbol, an outward sign of what's going on inside us. The Church of England, communion and baptism are the two sacraments that we celebrate because they are both commanded by Jesus in the Bible. The Catholic Church and some other denominations have more sacraments. I think there's 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. As Anglicans, we wouldn't necessarily call them sacraments, but it doesn't mean we don't value them. So Catholic won't say that a wedding is a sacrament because by getting married, there's an outward sign of something that's going on inside you. So inside you, you're declaring your love and you're committing to these people, to this other person. So that's an outward sign of something that's going on inside you. So that's what sacraments are. These robes that we're looking at here are robes that are generally reserved for things that aren't sacraments. So what does this choir dress look like? Usually you've got a black cassock underneath. What's the story behind the black cassock? Well, back in the day, clergy wore this out and about in town. It's kind of what professionals wore, in the same way that if you were in a professional job now, you might wear a suit to work. This was kind of the early modern equivalent of a suit. So you'd see lawyers wandering around in those things as well. So clergy wandered around in these things as they walked around their parishes as a kind of status symbol to remind people and to kind of say we are of a professional class. So that's the black cassock. Now the white surplice, which you'll see in the middle, that's back in the day what clergy used to wear in services. And that's because they'd walk around all day in their black cassock. It would get dirty and it would get smelly. So they'd slip this white surplice over the top so they looked presentable while they were leading the service. Also, if they were in a really cold church, they could put coats and furs underneath it and still look simple and smart at the front. So probably a modern equivalent would be if you are in a shirt and trousers at work and you get sweaty armpits, you might put the suit jacket over the top to hide the mess underneath the surplice. It's kind of the suit jacket in modern equivalents. And then the final bit on choir dress that I'm going to say is the black preaching scarf, which is this black strip of material that goes around the shoulders of the priest. What's it for? Don't know for sure. We think it could be a link to academia and academic robes. So it could be a slightly passive-aggressive way of reminding people who are listening to the sermon that they have been to university and they are educated. Also, I want to say before I move on to the second outfit, as it were, is that all of these can be worn by people that aren't ordained. So in some churches that have a robed choir, you might see a choir dressed like this. The black cassock might change to a different colour, but this is the sort of wear that a choir might wear, hence the name choir dress. Also, lay readers might dress like this. Karen Hatch is our lay reader in the benefice, and she wears something very similar to this. The only difference with Karen is that she wears a blue preaching scarf rather than a black one. Also, in some churches, you might see a verger wearing this. So just because this is often worn by clergy, it's not an exclusively clergy type of clothing. So this is choir dress. This is the most common type of robes that you'll see in the church. So this second lot I want to talk to you about, I can never say this word, is the Catholic vestments. These are still fairly widespread, but they're not as common as the other ones. These ones, if you're really into robes and you do your robing thing, these ones tend to be reserved for services that are sacraments, so i.e. the communion and the baptism services. You're more likely to see these in the higher, more Anglo-Catholic churches. So some of these individual pieces might have links to some ancient origins, but again, they are relatively modern for the Church of England. They're kind of mid-19th century, so a similar age to the dog collar, actually, to be fair. And they were things that were brought in by the Oxford movement, which, if you think back to our worship spectrum that we looked at earlier, the Oxford movement was a movement that kind of sprung up in the 19th century that kind of felt the church had slipped too far towards the low end and wanted to push us back towards the high Anglo-Catholic end. So they kind of brought in several different things, including this kind of dress for clergy. So what might you find in these kind of churches? What's this dress look like? Well, at the bottom layer, it's got a cassock alb, which looks very similar to the black one we saw in the last screen. The difference is that it is white. What's it for? I said they might have some ancient origins to these. Well, the first instances of priests wearing these white ones probably date back to the 3rd century. So it is potentially quite an early thing. Those robes sort of signify royalty, or at least they did in the 3rd century. So priests wore them as a way of reminding us that we are a royal priesthood, and that colour white signifies purity. Worth saying, of different vestments we're talking about on this page, this is the only one that non-clergy can wear. So the other two that we're about to talk about are clergy only, whereas this one, actually, lay people can wear this as well. So if we were a church, well, actually, we are a church that has deacons. When we have communion and Karen Hatch is around, she often deacons for me or Barbara. So she takes part in the service alongside me. So if Karen wanted to, she could wear a cassock alb rather than her choir dress if she was that way inclined, but she wouldn't wear the stole and the chasuble. So that's the cassock alb, that's the base layer. And then on top of that, we have a stole, which is a strip of material like the preaching scarf that we saw. The difference between the preaching scarf and the stole here is the preaching scarf is, I say it's always black. It's not always black because Karen's got a blue one. But you tend to have one colour of preaching scarf for you, whereas the stoles will change colour depending on the liturgical season. And it's one of those really annoying arguments you can get into. What's the difference between a preacher scarf and a stole? Practically visibly to anybody not in the know, not a lot. But there is a lot of significance kind of woven into it, a lot of debate around it. So some people get very offended if they see a stole but not a preaching scarf, and vice versa. No one really knows where this idea of a stole comes from, but there might be a link to the scarf of office worn by officers in the Roman Empire. Again, it fell out of use, but then it was brought back by the Oxford movement in the 19th century. Priests and deacons wear it in slightly different ways. I'll get into the difference between a priest and a deacon shortly. But for now, I'll just say you become a deacon first and then you become a priest. So a deacon is someone who's ordained that's not taken, who's taken the vows of a deacon, but not the vows of a priest. Deacons wear it like the red one on here, so a little bit like a Thunderbird puppet. Yeah, that's how deacons wear their stole, whereas priests wear it in the same way they'd wear a preaching scarf. Again, don't know why. Some suggestions as to why we have these things. Some people say it's to represent the towel with which Jesus washed the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper. Some people say it's reminiscent of the rope which led Jesus to Calvary. And some people say with it lying over your shoulders like that, it's like a yoke. Remember, Jesus said, "Take my yoke, which is easy." So we're not sure. There's lots of symbolism and debate about the stole, but that is the stole. And then on top of the stole, you have the chasuble, which has slightly secular origins. It derives from a poor man's rain covering, just means house. So it looks a little bit like a poncho, But I think, but it goes over the top of the alb and the stole. It's apparently meant to represent charity or love, and only priests can wear this, and only during communion services. So that's the second sort of type of dress you might see in communion service in the Church of England. I just want to pause briefly and talk to you about what you'll like to see in our benefice. So in our benefice, it will depend very much on who's presiding, what you might see. As Barbara and I have different approaches, ever so slightly different, and it probably depends on what type of service it is as well. So for myself, I tend to wear the cassock, alb, and stole for communions and baptisms. That was the second one, and it's an odd one because it's not necessarily what I would choose to wear from a theological perspective or even from an aesthetic perspective. I really don't like them for reasons that I won't go into. However, it's much cooler in the winter months. The pockets are much more accessible. So I just find my cassock alb more practical than my choir robes, even though the choir robes probably what I would prefer to wear when I have to wear a robe. But the cassock one is just, cassock alb is just so much more practical for me. So I wear that for communion and for baptisms. I wear the choir dress one for weddings, funerals, remembrance, carols by candlelight, anything like that. And the reason for that is I'm very aware of what people walking into church might think when they see the priests in their robes, whether it might look a little bit odd to people that aren't churchgoers. I certainly have not grown up seeing clergy wearing robes. I found it odd the first time I walked into a church with robes. And I kind of feel that actually that choir dress, the black stole, black cassock with the surplice, might be more familiar to people outside the church if they've seen 4 weddings and a funeral or something like that. So I feel like I don't like robes. I don't think they're that accessible. I think they do create a barrier, but I feel like the choir dress is a bit more accessible and a bit less alienating than those other the cassock alb and robe and stole, even though the cassock alb has better pockets. As a general rule, I try and wear just a plain clergy shirt with the dog collar so people know who I am with any service I think I can get away with. So realistically, that's our Celtic stream and our all sorts stream. I have to robe for the communion services. And the reason that I would rather do away with robes if it was up to me is I don't like being marked out as different or more special than people in the pews. We're all called to serve God. We all have a role in his kingdom, whether you're a priest or whether you're not. So I'd rather just dispense with the robes and just be on the same level as everybody else. I don't like the kind of perceived hierarchy that robes might be seen to give. Barbara, on the other hand, has a different perspective to me. So Barbara tends to wear the choir dress. She told me she does have a cassock alb, but she tends to wear the choir dress when she robes. But her cassock isn't black like mine because she's a canon of Coventry Cathedral, which is an honorary title. And she's encouraged by the bishop to show her allegiance to the cathedral by wearing her kind of mushroom robes as often as she can. Her feelings on the robes are very different to mine. She prefers to wear robes and the appropriate stoles and wear if possible a dog collar. And she says that's because her route into ordination came through her work as a farmer. She's self-supporting, so she was working and ministering at the same time. So she had this kind of split life. So wearing collar and the robes helped her to have the spiritual strength needed to move on from one role to another, which I think is quite interesting and does actually show why there's such a variety of different attitudes that actually all are helpful, aren't they? That actually Barbara's ministering in a new context and she is in a context she knows well. She's been around the area a lot. So for Barbara, the robes help to say, look, different phase of life. I am this now. I'm different to what I was. Whereas I've come in from outside. Nobody knows my background or history. They don't know me from before. And I want to push that I'm no different. Whereas Barbara, coming from within the community, wants to push that she is different now. So it's an interesting dynamic of what the robes do, don't they? They do project the fact that there is something different about us, which there's a time and a place for. But also, if we take that too far, it can feel like there's division between clergy and laity, which isn't always healthy and helpful. So that's just some thoughts on robes, what you might find across the Church of England and what you might find in our benefice. So we're going to think a little bit about communion now in a purely practical way, and about what communion looks like when it's set up in our churches. So it probably won't surprise you to learn that no two churches do it the same when it comes to setting up communion. But I'm going to talk you through some things you're likely to find on the table or altar at the front at communion. So this is a fairly comprehensive graphic of the various things you might find. So there's quite a few things here. So the cruets, those little glass bottles. There's usually two of them, one with wine in it and one with water in it. Then we've got the pal, which is a little cardboard covering cloth square. We've got the purificator, which is sort of like a serviette, posh serviette. Chalice, big golden cup for the wine. Paten, little golden plate. Tiborium, which is it kind of is like a cup with a lid. That's where wafers get put. Then we've got the corporal, which Karen had told me off to call it a tea towel before. It's not a tea towel. It's linen cloth, roughly the size and shape of a tea towel. And then you've got, I can never say this, lavabo and finger towel, little pot of water and little serviette. And then we've got the post-communion chalice veil and burse on the right side outside the graphic. That's another thing I want to call a tea towel. It's a bit posher than tea towel. And a kind of another cardboard thing similar to the pal, but it's quite thick and it opens up. So those are the main things you're likely to see in most churches, Anglican churches. Not all churches have all of these things. And as we look to see what we would have as a general rule in our benefice, this might give you an idea of how different it could be. There we go. So we have most of these things in our churches, but not all of them. So we don't have ciborium, we don't tend to, because we do use wafers. But I think our biggest service, we tend to have 30 to 40 people. So there's more than enough room on the paten for that. We don't need a ciborium, which is where you've got a lot of extra wafers in it. We don't have the lavabo and finger towel. Still can't say it. We wash our hands with antibac gel, which is a throwback to COVID, really. There is a ceremonial element to the washing, which is why it was traditionally done before COVID, but our antibac gel has kind of trumped that. So those are things we don't have on that list. We have pretty much everything else. Just to say a little few things on it. Just talk about the cruets and the wine and the water. You may be wondering, why do we put water in the wine at communion? I think the reason we do it is to water it down to make the wine go further and to stop the priest getting too tipsy when they finish it off at the end. That's what the cynic in me thinks. I have heard that the wine symbolizes Jesus' divine nature and the water symbolizes his human nature, which I'm sure is true. But the cynic in me thinks the practical came first and they came up with a theological reason afterwards. So that's why we have water and wine. Just saying that pal, that little cardboard thing covered in white fabric that rests on the top. What's that for? That's to stop bat droppings falling into the wine. It's purely practical thing. It stops bat poo falling into the communion wine before we have a chance to drink it. The purificator was that cloth. That is there when we take the common cup, you kind of give it a wipe. So it's about a hygiene thing. Don't use it at the moment because we're not using the common cup. But if we do return to the common cup, then then we will be bringing the purificator back into use. So when I say common cup, I mean everybody taking a sip. At the moment we dip, but we might return to sipping, in which case we'll be cleaning the cup between sips. Corporal, the main function of the corporal is to collect any crumbs that fall out of the bread. So I generally forget to put it out because when we're using wafers, crumbs aren't really that much of an issue. So one thing that actually comes out from the corporal in particular is that actually in the Church of England, whether you're high church or low church, there is some common ground that something special is happening. And as a priest, I've promised that if there's leftover communion wine or wafers, I will ensure that they are consumed reverently, I think is the phrase I used when I made my promises. So the bread and the wine after it's been consecrated, it is special. And so we need to treat it with the appropriate level of respect and dignity, which is where the post-communion chalice and veil and burse come into it. So that covers it up and makes it look pretty and nice afterwards. As I say, I take that seriously, the fact that I've promised to consume it reverently afterwards and to treat it with respect. But thinking about that spectrum, the appropriate amount of respect is going to vary depending on where you fall on that high to low spectrum. If you are virtually Catholic and believe in transubstantiation, then that you're going to be much more thorough and paying a lot more respect to it than if you're at the low end of the spectrum, which, just to remind us, we should finish it off well, because we've promised to, and we should. It's reminded us of something special, but you're not going to be as worried about it as if you're at the other end of the spectrum. So those are the items. There is a way that we back them to look nice and neat. You don't really need to do this, but I'm showing it to you just in case there's any sacristans watching this who want a reminder. So basically, we make a little tower with the veil and the burse over the top to make it all look neat and tidy. We do that at the beginning and we do that at the end. And it's just about making it look tidy, really. No other reason than that. So essentially, we've gone through all of these different items that you have on the table. But of all of these items, there's quite a lot of them. There's three key things you need. You need the cup, you need the wine, you need the wafers and the bread. That's what you need. If you've got those three things and a priest, you can have communion. Everything else is nice to have, but it's optional. So that's communion. We're going to very quickly now look at the liturgical colours. So if you've spent much time in any of our churches over the course of a year, you might notice different things change in terms of colour during the year. So most of our churches at the table or altar at the front, they've got altar cloth. That changes colour at different points in the year. We've mentioned the stoles already. So the stoles that the priest is wearing will change at different points in the year. And also the burse and the communion veil that we were literally just looking at, that will normally be changed to match the altar front. And some of our churches have extra little bits that we might put on the lecterns or the pulpit or something. So there's lots of different little places that you might see colour changing throughout the year. I won't go into every colour change, but just to give you a little flavour of why that happens and how that happens, is the church year is meant to kind of follow the life of Jesus. So the church year starts at Advent. It doesn't start January the 1st. It starts December the 1st with Advent, which is when the angel Gabriel came to tell Mary she was expecting a baby. So when Advent starts, everything will be purple, all of those things that I mentioned, because purple is generally reserved for times of waiting. So we're purple during Advent because we're waiting for Jesus to be born. And then we get to Christmas, Christmas Day, and we go gold or white. Gold and white is there for days of celebration. and feast days. So we go from purple for Advent to gold for Christmas. And then after Christmas time, we kind of slip into green, which is always for what we call ordinary time. So there's nothing special going on, it's just ordinary. So we go from Christmas to ordinary time, and then we will stick with ordinary time until we go into Lent, which might go back to purple, as Lent is a time of waiting and preparation for Holy Week. So we go to purple for Lent. Then as we get to Holy Week itself, we go into red. Red is for Holy Week, for Pentecost, and anything to do with people dying and being martyred, basically. Holy Week in red. Then we go white or gold because it's Easter season and we are celebrating. And then after Easter season, we're back into ordinary time when we're not marking anything in particular, and we'll stick with that all through to the next church year, which will take us back to purple and back to Advent. So there's a sort of flow to the year just to keep us on our toes. It changes every now and then. So gold or white is for celebration. We celebrate Trinity Sunday, so we'll randomly go from green to yellow for Trinity Sunday and then back to green. The red, as I said, we do Holy Week for Pentecost because it reminds us of the Holy Spirit, but it also reminds us of blood. So if we happen to be remembering a particular saint who was martyred, then we'll just switch to red for that. So there's a couple of weeks where we randomly go one colour and then back again. But there's a general flow to the church year, which I have just talked you through. So that's all I'm going to say about the liturgical colours. And we're getting towards the end, don't worry. But we're now going to have a little think about the kind of structures in the Church of England. So there's a few different structures that I want to talk to you about. And the first is to do with priests and sort of different types of clergy that you get. So this is thinking particularly about people that have been ordained, because there's three different types of ordination. So you can be ordained three things. You can be ordained a deacon, you can be ordained a priest, and you can be ordained a bishop. Now, the way it normally starts is you are usually ordained as a deacon, and you do that. That's kind of your first day as being clergy. So if you do a curacy, which is sort of trainee vicar with L plates type thing, first day you're ordained as a deacon, which means from the first day you start wearing your dog collar, you can start wearing your robes. Obviously, you wear your stole like a Thunderbird, as we've said. But day one, you are deaconed, you're ordained a deacon. And from that moment, you wear the dog collar, you can start baptizing people. And technically, you can marry people, but you don't tend to because you're deaconed just before you start. And you have a whole year where you're a deacon, but you haven't been ordained a priest. So you can't do the things a priest can do. You can only do the things a deacon can do. And although there are some people that remain a deacon, increasingly they've brought in this thing called the distinctive diaconate, where people who deliberately stay a deacon. For most people, they're deaconed a year before they're priested. And the idea is that deacon's year is, it's an opportunity to just get used to being ordained and not worry about the more complicated stuff. Get your head around this stuff before you get all the priestly stuff. As well. It's also an important way of kind of focusing yourself, because they say deacon means service. So in that year, you're meant to really focus on being of service to those around you. They also say the deacon's year is the year in which you're meant to be thinking more about outside the church than inside the church. When you are a priest, there's certain things that you have to be a priest to do, and you become very church focused, thinking all about what's going on inside church. You forget about the world outside. So the deacon year is meant to be a year when you're particularly thinking about the world outside church and how the church might be able to reach them. So that's a deacon. And then typically after you've been a deacon for a year, you are ordained as a priest. So that means you can start wearing your stole like a preaching scarf rather than like a Thunderbird. You're allowed to preside at communion. You're also allowed to pray the prayer of absolution, which you can't do as a deacon or a lay member. And you're allowed to pray blessing, which again, deacons shouldn't be doing and lay people shouldn't be doing. So there's some more things that you can do. I think the important thing to say about priests and deacons and bishops actually is that it's a bit like being a king or queen of Narnia, in that once you're these things, you don't cease to be them. So when you become a priest, you don't stop being a deacon, you're a deacon and a priest. So all those things you promised to do when you're ordained a deacon, you still have to do them. So although as a priest you're promising to do communion and pray the prayer of absolution and pray blessings and all those kind of things, you're not meant to stop looking outside, being a servant and all those kind of things. You hang on to both the priest role and the deacon role. So every vicar in the Church of England is a deacon and a priest. But some people are called to be bishops as well. So as Bishop Christopher, for example. What bishops can do that priests and deacons can't do is bishops can confirm people and bishops can ordain people. And the really cool thing about this is, like I said, you don't lose your previous calling just because you've got the next one. So Bishop Christopher is a bishop, unlike me and Barbara, but he's also a priest and a deacon. So whilst he can do things that Barbara and I can't, he's still promised to do the priestly things and the deacony things that we've all promised to do. So you don't lose jobs by moving on to the next one. You collect them, but you kind of committed to all of them, which I think is quite cool. So these are the three key sort of vocational titles in the Church of England, and it's interesting. I don't want to think of it as a career, but an extent in this list, Barbara and I kind of peaked. Unless you go on to become a bishop, we've peaked professionally 12 months into our career as we were deacons. 12 months later, we were priested. Unless we become a bishop, which is unlikely, that's as many ordinations as we're going to have. We've got all that 12 months in. So those are kind of the spiritual titles, if you like. But alongside these sort of spiritual titles, we've got more kind of jobby titles, really. So these are just some job titles you might hear in the Church of England: curate, vicar, rector, area dean, archdeacon, priest in charge, associate minister, youth minister, chaplain is another one you might hear. All of these jobs, people will probably be deacons and probably be priests as well as these things, but they say more about what you're doing on a day-to-day role within the structure of the Church of England. So essentially, priest in charge, rector and vicar are pretty much the same thing. To be honest, we sometimes say that's an incumbent. So I'm the incumbent of the Draycott and Len Valley benefice. I'm the incumbent of each individual parish. I'm also the priest in charge. At some point in the future, I will become a rector or a vicar, because priest in charge is meant to be like a placeholder title. It's priest in charge because we were two separate benefices. Now we are one benefice. At some point, I'll need to be relicensed as a vicar or a rector. It won't change anything about the day-to-day of what I'm doing, but it will just be a different name, a different title on the email signature. I don't know whether I'll be a vicar or a rector when we get round to doing that. It's all very complicated and legal and obscure. It comes down to who owns the rectory. I don't quite understand it, but priest in charge, rector, vicar is what they mean, is incumbent. It's all the same thing, just some obscure legal differences. Curate, when we hear the word curate, we tend to think trainee, a vicar with L plates who works alongside a training incumbent. That's the kind of understood curate at the moment. Interestingly, actually, technically, that's an assistant curate. Technically, actually, the vicar, rector, and priest in charge are also a curate. Curate takes the root for curate is cure of souls. So in the Church of England, we'll see in a moment, the bishop holds the cure of souls. for everyone in the parish, and he shares that with the incumbent. So that curate actually refers to the incumbent and the bishop. But we've changed that for some reason. That's why in the BCP we pray for bishops and curates, which might sound a bit odd if you didn't know that. But when we say curate, we mean vicars. We don't mean trainee vicars. Then you've got your area deans, your archdeacons, people that are, again, they will be priests and deacons. Our area dean does his job alongside being in parish ministry. An archdeacon is probably not doing parish ministry anymore. They're still a priest and a deacon, but they have this role within the diocese. Associate minister, Barbara's our associate minister. She's a priest, as we'll see in a minute. She's a priest, she's a deacon, but she's not the incumbent. She's not in overall charge of the church. She works alongside me in doing that. All of which is a long-winded way of saying, basically, in our benefice, we've got two priests who also happen to be, who are also deacons. One priest is me, and my job title is priest in charge. One priest is Barbara, and her title is associate minister. So that's a little bit about the structure in terms of clergy and titles and stuff. I hope that makes some kind of sense. And then the very last thing I want to talk you through is how the Church of England is structured. Because it can be very confusing. You might have been at the APCMs recently and thought, oh, we're electing, what's a synod? Why are we electing people to deanery synods? You may have heard stuff in the news about LLF and general synod. Like, what's all this? How does this all fit together? Well, as with all centuries-old institutions, it's a lot more complicated now than it used to be. So in green, you can see how it always used to be and how it always was, in that you had your bishop, in our case, Bishop Christopher. He's in charge of all the parishes in the Diocese of Coventry, and he's meant to be running all of them, but rather than running all however many hundred parishes it is, he appoints an incumbent parish priest to look after individual parishes, and they look after them in conjunction with the PCCs. So those three in red are all historically, that's the structure of the Church of England: bishop, priest, PCCs, bishops in charge, priests, PCCs work together to run the church. That's pretty simple, really, isn't it? Being 500 years old and looking after the whole country, things got a little bit more complicated than that. So we end up having kind of layers. So we've got the PCCs and me. We look after each of our individual parishes. We're this thing called a benefice, which is 8 parishes working together to share the vicar and pool resources. Our benefice is part of a deanery. So we're part of Rugby Deanery, which is all the churches in the Rugby area. And we send representatives to Deanery Synod, which is kind of like a bit like a parliament for all of the parishes in Rugby. The person that organises that and looks after that is the rural dean. In our case, that's a guy called Steve Gold. He takes on the role of rural dean of looking after all the clergy in Rugby alongside his job as a parish priest. So he's the vicar in Hill Morton, and he also does this sort of on top of that. It's a kind of a collegiate thing where he works alongside to help organise the clergy in the deanery. Our deanery is part of the Diocese of Coventry. So there's a couple of deaneries within the diocese. Diocese of Coventry has its own synod in the same way deanery has a synod. There's a diocesan synod that the bishop looks after. I've added into the structure, we've also got archdeacons at this point. So Bishop Christopher is in charge of the whole of the diocese, but he's got a series of archdeacons having a bit of a restructure at the moment. Archdeacon Barry is one of them, and the archdeacons are kind of Bishop Christopher's hands and feet. So Bishop Christopher might not make it to every parish to check on what every parish is doing, but he'll have archdeacons that will come and see us and be involved in appointing clergy and all that kind of thing. So the archdeacons kind of work very closely with the bishop to help the bishop look after his individual deaneries and parishes. So that's diocesan level. And then you've got kind of a national level. So we've got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. He's sort of theoretically in charge of all of the south of the Church of England, with the Archbishop of York in charge of the north, and then Justin kind of the slightly more senior of the two. So that's already got complicated. And there's another synod here. This is the General Synod, and this is where stuff is discussed that affects the whole of the Church of England. So it's really quick and rough and ready. But in some ways, you don't need to know this. You come into church on a Sunday, you sit down, you pray, you worship, you meet with God, who the Archbishop of Canterbury happens to be. It's not strictly relevant on a day-to-day basis, but I think it is important to see that actually we are part of something bigger, and it's complicated because the church is complicated. The point is we are local and national. We are the Church of England. We cover the whole of England. Actually, the Anglican Church covers the whole of the world, but we're also very local. We're national and local. I hope that's helpful. If I've just confused you, just ignore what I've said, really. Thank you for watching, if indeed you still are. Just by way of closing, I want to say I hope that was helpful. I realise I covered an awful lot in a short space of time, and some of it will seem like quite random details. You think, oh, I don't need to know that. Maybe you don't need to know all of the ins and outs of everything. But I think there is something healthy about asking, well, why do we do what we do? What am I learning? What are we saying when we say these things? So I encourage you to see this as kind of the start of a conversation, and just going forwards, if anything I've said there doesn't make any sense, do come back to me and ask me to explain it better, or ask someone else to explain it better. Or in fact, it makes perfect sense, but it raises other questions. Do ask, because I think it's in asking these questions and exploring the answers together we can deepen our faith, and our worship experience can be enhanced, as these things that can seem quite random or weird can take on a more profound resonance for us. So thank you ever so much, and I will see you around soon.